My name is Fred Steinman. I currently serve as the Northern Section Director for the Nevada Chapter of the American Planning Association, and also currently serve as the Director of the University Center for Economic Development at the University of Nevada, Reno. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's educational session sponsored by the chapter. This is our last formal educational session for 2022, but rest assured, we here in the Northern Section, the section officers and our Northern Section or our Southern Section and chapter counterparts are working hard on developing educational sessions for 2023. Hard to believe that we are having that conversation. Before I start the presentation, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. First and foremost, please make sure that your microphone is muted for today's presentation. That way we can avoid cross traffic and chatter and noise during the presentation. After I get through the presentation, there's quite a bit to go over as we will look at special assessment districts, general improvement districts, tax increment areas, and redevelopment districts. We'll have plenty of time at the end for question and answer, as well as larger discussion. Also, for those of you living near, around the Reno-Sparks area, Carson City, Douglas County, Fernley, or might just be in town this weekend, the Northern Section, we are hosting our annual holiday party this Sunday, December 11th, up at the university. The mixer will begin at 11 a.m. and go to 1 p.m. and will be held up at the Joe Crowley Student Union. And we also have tickets to the UNR women's basketball game, the holiday game for the women's team, with tip-off starting at 1 o'clock. So if you are interested in attending that event, please go ahead and just email me at fred@unr.edu, and I'd be more than happy to send you additional information about this Sunday's holiday event. But again, welcoming you to today's educational session. Hopefully all of you are seeing slide one, the cover slide of my presentation, existing special assessment districts and community and economic development funding tools in Nevada. Really the topic of today's presentation. This presentation is a presentation actually I've given a number of times to various jurisdictions and economic development, community development organizations throughout the states. For those of you that work for various public sector organizations like cities and counties and other entities, maybe even some private sector groups, you all know how difficult it is for local governments in particular in Nevada to finance various community and economic development projects and initiatives and programs and services. Nevada's fiscal system, the wackiness that it is, makes it very difficult to fund long-term programs and services and infrastructure assets. I've always said that pretty much any fool can build a road from A to B. The real challenge is thinking about how you maintain and improve that road over the course of 10, 15, 30, 40, even 50 years. And our fiscal system, be it the property tax side or the dependency for some communities on sales and use tax, and to a lesser extent, other sources like business tax revenue or transient lodging tax revenue, is really just insufficient. It's very difficult for jurisdictions to continue to fund long-term various programs, services, resources, and assets and facilities that communities need to function just at a basic level, and even more challenging and difficult as we think about the longer term and more broad economic development efforts that we get into. So this is a presentation I've given again a couple of times over the last several years to various groups and entities interested in these things. Because the good news is that there are tools in the toolbox that the state legislature over the decades have created and enabled and empowered local governments and other entities to use as a funding tool. I always do like to preface this conversation by making it very clear I'm not an attorney and this isn't legal advice. At the end of the day, if you're going to explore and start using some of these tools, it is very good to start having a conversation with your legal counsel, because there are, legal issues that you do have to take into consideration. So please do not take what I am about to say during this presentation as gospel. Hopefully, it helps spark some ideas, and potential ways that you and your organization might decide to pursue. And if you do decide to pursue them, again, starting with a conversation in-house with legal counsel and other stakeholders and parties is probably a good way to go. So with that, again, at the end of the presentation, we'll get into Q&A and discussion. So over the course of the presentation, given I have about 30 or so slides, if you could just write down your questions on a piece of paper or maybe even in the chat box, and then we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. But again, today's presentation is really focused on existing special assessment districts and all the various, well, not all, but a number of the community and economic development funding tools that are available in the state of Nevada. Specifically for the presentation today, we're going to talk on what I like to kind of refer to as the big four, or the four that have become more popular over the last decade or so, or we have more experience with at a local government level. There are a number of other tools in the toolbox, but a lot of those other tools are very specialized tools that apply to very specific public sector or even to a certain degree private sector and nonprofit community-based organizations. These are kind of like I said, the big four that have broad application in a number of areas. The real bulk of the presentation is really going to be focused on special assessment districts as outlined in Nevada Revised Statute Chapter 271. Currently, or at least the last time I did a real comprehensive look at how many SADs are in existence, there were 88 of them back in 2016 and 17. And I think over the last 5 or so years, there's been about 7 or 8 additional SADs created throughout the state. Tax increment areas, as outlined in Nevada Revised Statute Chapter 278C, is kind of the dark horse darling of this big four group. As far as I know, there's only actually one active TIA under 278C in existence and operating today. And that's the one that Nevada State College and the city of Henderson established a number of years ago to help finance the growth and development of Nevada State College. Although there may be other districts and funding mechanisms that have been formed under 278C, they've been very, very specialized, requiring additional, essentially permission from the legislature to pursue. Then there's redevelopment under NRS Chapter 279. And redevelopment, as we'll talk about, is really the great granddaddy of all these various special financing tools. Just about every state in the United States has some form of authorizing redevelopment agency district financing authorizing legislation. The very first redevelopment statutes in the United States go back to the early 1940s, and in Nevada, really back to the mid to early 1940s. As the federal government started the process of federal urban renewal, which kind of morphed into things like community development block granting, block grant financing, but redevelopment's been around for a very long time. There's a large track record for it. And the last time I checked, there were 14 active redevelopment districts in the state, ranging from smaller, more rural, non-metro communities in the state to pretty much all the large urban metropolitan statistical area communities in the state. There's not a lot of myth behind redevelopment, but there are a couple things that we have to take into consideration as we think about potentially resurrecting or revitalizing the use of redevelopment in the state. And then there are the general improvement districts under NRS Chapter 318. These have really kind of fallen out of favor in the last several years. They used to be very popular, especially in the 1980s and through the 1990s and maybe into the early 2000s. But as of the current fiscal year, or the previous fiscal year, 2022, or no, the current fiscal year, 22 to 23, there were 28 active general improvement districts under Chapter 318 in existence. And we'll talk as to why they've kind of fallen out of favor. Usually has to do to the relationship of the incremental property tax financing permitted under 318 and its relationship to the state cap on property tax rates on taxing entities in the state. But like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit. But again, as bolded and italicized, SADs have become very popular throughout the states and growing popularity, and tax increment areas are kind of the dark horse of this, with more jurisdictions kind of looking at what the city of Henderson and Nevada State College have done, and started to at least have internal conversations about how to use that. Redevelopment, we know what it is, we know how it works, we'll talk about it, but there's no mystery there. And general improvement districts, just because they've fallen out of favor, we'll probably only touch on fairly briefly. But given the growing importance and interest in the SADs under Chapter 271, I thought we'd start our conversation there. Generally, and again, not an attorney, so make sure that if you start the process of considering and then creating an SAD, you definitely want to talk to legal counsel, because this is a very summarized, very general, very broad outline of the general steps that are involved in the establishment of an NRS Chapter 271 Special Assessment District, and all the subsequent sub-SADs that exist in the statute. For example, recently, a couple sessions ago, the legislature modified 271 to enable the creation of what we could loosely refer to as a business improvement district, although there are some issues there, and also amended 271 to allow jurisdictions to create fire improvement districts. Not that we're going to light anything on fire, but 271 SADs that are specific to supporting the development of additional fire protection services at a jurisdictional level. Either way, the process usually begins, at least formally, with the local government, and a local government, city or county, are the only ones that have the actual authority to begin this process and to establish an SAD. There's an asterisk there, but ultimately you start with either a city government or a county government designating an area for consideration, a study area. Typically, the city or county engineer, or who is the designate to be the city or county engineer, and whoever the engineer designates to work on their behalf, will serve as what is outlined in NRS 271 as the assessment district coordinator. It takes nothing more than a provisional order resolution, the city council or the county commission just telling staff, go study it, right? We're interested in creating one of these things. We need you to go ahead and start the process of studying the feasibility and potential of establishing the 271 district. Then over the course of time, and it can be as quickly as a week or several months or a year plus, however long it takes, the city or county engineer or designate, like a consultant or other members of staff, will complete what is outlined in 271, a fiscal and economic impact study. And that's nothing more than a document that lays out what the purpose of the special assessment district is going to be. Are we going to finance, the construction of new roads or the maintenance of roads? Are we going to build a public facility like a swimming pool or something else? How much is it going to cost? How are we going to generate the needed revenue and income to support the construction, the maintenance, the staff, all the related expenditures, and what are going to be the impacts to the community or the area where the SAD is going to be. Again, there are some other technical elements that have to be included in that fiscal and economic impact study. But it really does come down to just simply identifying what the impacts are going to be, how you're going to finance it, and how the SAD is going to be financed and then administered moving forward. Then you go through the normal process of, developing, drafting, reading, approving ordinances by the local government, again, either the city council or county commission, whatever hoops that you have to jump through in terms of local, ordinances and procedures, and of course, all being compliant with the state open meeting law. You go through reading an ordinance and approving that ordinance to establish the special assessment district. And then when you're all done with that, then the actual work begins, right? You're going to now go through a process of generating annual budgets. Those budgets, again, in conformance with all state law expectations, local expectations, and whatever other financial recording and reporting requirements that are subject to your jurisdiction, how much money you anticipate, how much revenue you're going to generate, and how things are going to be spent over the course of each year will be developed. And then you go about the business of whatever the special assessment district is designed to do. Pretty pro forma work in terms of beginning the process of studying the feasibility of creating the district, and then again, the process of actually doing the work that the special assessment district is designed to do. It is important upfront to understand that special assessment districts, as outlined in NRS Chapter 271, essentially operate from a budgetary and fiscal standpoint the complete opposite way that we understand public finance to work. Typically in the world of public finance, you begin with an estimation of revenue, right? Every time we start, and many jurisdictions are right now beginning the process of drafting and developing their budgets for the coming fiscal year, you begin with an idea of how much revenue you got to play with, right? How much are we going to collect in the next year in terms of property tax revenue or sales and use tax revenue, business license revenue, special fees? What are we potentially going to bring in terms of grants and maybe other even philanthropic sources, intergovernmental transfer revenues, selling of assets, investments? We start with an idea of how much money we have to play with. And then we go through the Thunderdome process, right? All the departments, all the agencies, all the entities within the city or the county government, starts the horse trading process. Well, I want a 5% bump in my budget because I have this project I want to do. No, I need a 10% bump because I need to go hire 3 more people. And then ultimately your city council or your county commission makes the ultimate decision on the final budget. And then you go through the process of collecting revenues and making expenditures and recording that as appropriate through the fiscal year. Special assessment districts in 271 completely reverses that process, where we actually have to begin with an idea of what we're going to spend. And then from that estimation on a year-by-year basis of what we need in terms of revenue, we create and construct an assessment and collect that assessment in order to generate the revenue needed to meet our expenditure estimates. It takes a little while to get your head around that idea, that you actually reverse the public budgeting process when you use 271 SADs. You always begin with an estimation of costs first, and then you construct and implement the assessment process in order to generate the revenue needed in order to support those expenditures. It is also important to keep in mind that special assessment districts under 271 are not a tax. It may quack like a tax, it may walk like a tax, but it is not a tax. It is an assessment. And the legislature in 271 went to great pains to ensure that that was clear. So unlike general improvement districts, that is a tax, you do not have to ensure that the assessment you create under 271 fits under the state mandated ad valorem property tax cap. because even though you may create an assessment that looks like a property tax, it's not. It's an assessment. It's a fee that you are imposing upon properties within the established special assessment district, or businesses or residents. It doesn't even necessarily need to be tied to property. And that's why we don't place SADs under the same restrictions and limitations that you may see with general improvement districts and other types of funding techniques. That's important to keep in mind, because again, we're trying to generate enough revenue in order to support the anticipated expenditures on a year-to-year basis under 271. As I've already mentioned, the SAD itself, once established, can be directly administered and managed excuse me, by the city government or county government that establishes it in the first place, or the city or county government that established the SAD in the first place can actually, to a degree, hand off responsibility for management, establishment and collection of assessments, expenditures, budgeting, all of that to the designate of the city council or the county commission. We've seen a bit of this recently over the last decade or so, as cities and counties, cities in particular, have used SADs and created special assessment districts at the request of developers who are doing master plan communities and may establish an HOA or a similar governing body. They go to the city council or the county commission and say, hey, we need to put in a major piece of infrastructure or a public facility or provide a public service. We want to use an SAD to fund that over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, whatever. You have to create it as the city or county, but at the end of the day, you know, we'll take over direct responsibility for administration, management, and implementation. And that's completely permissible. We've also started to see that process with the new pseudo business improvement district language that's been added to 271. Those jurisdictions that have employed 271 for quote unquote business improvement district efforts have essentially created business improvement district associations of business owners and property owners within that SAD, that geographic area, to do all the administration and implementation and administration. Even though you can potentially designate to someone else other than the city or county government that creates it, ultimately, however, sole power and authority still rests with the city and the county. So if the city council or the county commission gets to year 9 or year 17 of the SAD's existence and says, we've had it, right? It's not working, it's screwed up, enough is enough, or maybe it's already fulfilled its purpose and it doesn't need to exist anymore. Ultimately, the city council or the county commission that created it can dissolve the district. There are asterisks with that, because if there's outstanding debt and you can use an SAD and the assessments that you create and collect on an annual basis with 271 to secure publicly issued debt at favorable public agency interest rates, you may have to extend the life or sunset the life of the district in order to make sure that that debt is repaid, because you don't want to get into the habit, obviously, of defaulting on debt that you've issued. There is some question out there as to whether or not, you know, debt that is issued by a special assessment district is just the responsibility of that SAD. And if it goes belly up, then the SAD goes away and the debt goes away with no harm, no foul, or whether or not the city or the county that creates it in the first place becomes responsible for that debt if the SAD collapses. I'm not sure that that question has been sorted out, you know, in the courts or legislatively. But it is something to kind of keep in mind moving forward. But ultimately, the city and the county government that creates it, that brought it into existence, has the power to take it out of existence. There are a number of eligible projects that SADs can be used to finance. This is not an exhaustive list of everything that is listed in 271. Generally, if it is a pseudo type of public infrastructure or public facility or even public service that a city or county would provide, it is eligible for financing through an SAD NRS 271 district. Curb and gutter projects, renewable energy projects, transportation projects, electric telephone projects, underground conversion projects, taking overhead electrical and putting it underground. We see a lot of that, especially in our urban built environments and areas where we're trying to do redevelopment or revitalization and general improvements. Undergrounding utilities is a big part of that, are all permissible uses. And there are cases in Nevada where 271 SADs have been used to finance multiple of these eligible projects within the same single SAD. Now, things like general improvement districts under 318 typically have to be sole project districts. They are created to fund one thing and one thing only. That has not been the case with the SADs. Although most of the SADs that already exist tend to function as one project, one purpose districts. But there are examples out there of SADs existing that do more than one thing and finance a variety of projects, infrastructure assets, public facilities, and even public services, which I think really speaks to the versatility of 271 and its broad appeal to many jurisdictions. Like most parts of the Nevada revised statutes, there are exemptions and exceptions and restrictions and limitations based upon the population of the jurisdiction creating the SAD in the first place. The last bullet on this slide is just kind of a flavor of that. Again, like most parts of the NRS, you really got to just dive into it and figure out the size of your jurisdiction and which parts of 271 apply to you and which parts don't, based upon your jurisdiction's population size. But that's pretty prototypical, and we're pretty used to that at this point in Nevada. Other things that you can use 271 districts to do. You can use it as either the public entity, the city or the county, or the designate that is going to be responsible for using the SAD to acquire existing property, to assemble land, to do demolition that is needed of either publicly owned property and resources or even privately sector owned resources. Of course, that opens a whole other can of worms that I don't really want to touch upon because we could be here till rapture addressing, but we have seen SADs used by public sector and private sector entities to do acquisition, assembly, and demolition of property as needed to support new development and new construction. Not uncommon and becoming more common to see SADs and the city and the county and potential private sector interests working with various local economic development organizations like the various regional economic development authorities that exist in the state, or existing redevelopment agencies or other entities to leverage resources. Typically, a lot of the economic development we do in the built environment, be it Elko or Fernley or Tonopah or Reno or Las Vegas, the cost of infill development is astronomically more expensive than greenfield development, right? Just building brand new in undisturbed, unbuilt areas, although you run into some infrastructure issues there. But you have to go through that process of acquisition, assembly, demolition. You might have to do brownfield and environmental remediation of sites. The cost is typically prohibitive for one funding source, one entity to do all the work. So SADs can be used as a leveraging tool to support the efforts of other entities. There's an example here in the city of Reno of that. Part of Reno Redevelopment District number 2 that includes an area in the Boomtown Verdi area. The city of Reno established both a redevelopment district to support some improvements that Boomtown was going to pursue and did complete, as well as the development of the new Cabela's. Well, I say new, but it's been there for almost 10 years now, believe it or not. The SAD was used specifically to finance some major infrastructure improvements. Generally speaking, kind of a reconfiguration of the intersection of feeder streets and US Interstate 80, while the redevelopment district was used to finance some property acquisition and some additional site remediation to support developers. And then on top of that, a tourism improvement district was used to assist Cabela's specifically to build the new Cabela's. So in that case, you had an SAD layered over a redevelopment district layered on top of a tourism improvement district in order to leverage enough resources to do all the things necessary to support that new project and that new construction. Now, after that, the legislature said that's probably too much, and you can't, at least now moving forward, layer a redevelopment district on top of a tourism improvement district. You have to pick one or the other. But at least in the case of the city of Reno, they were able to sneak in and get that SAD layered on top of a redevelopment district and the tourism improvement district, again, to generate and leverage enough resources to complete the project in an already built environment. And SADs have also been used to do non-property based approaches to community and economic development. Right now, there is only one active commercial area vitalization program project in the state of Nevada, CAVP, which is a subset of NRS Chapter 271, the SADs. And that is an SAD CAVP that covers the Fremont Street experience in downtown Las Vegas. That CAVP was kind of, I don't want to say poor man's version of a business improvement district, but because when it was established, there was nothing else that looked like a business improvement district, that's what was used to essentially create a business improvement district for the Fremont Street experience. That CAVP SAD under 271 has been in the past used to collect additional sales tax revenue for the SAD to do things like developing marketing material and advertising the Fremont Street experience and existing businesses located within that established district. Some SADs have even used it to do things like local restaurant guides and support existing merchants. We're seeing that a bit with the new pseudo business improvement districts that have been created over the last couple of years as a result of some of the new language that has been written into 271 by the legislature. So again, and this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, there are a lot of things that you can do with NRS Chapter 271. Again, as you start the process, if you start the process to create an SAD, you want to really make sure, again, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I just don't want to get anybody in trouble. Talk to legal counsel and have open, honest, frank discussions about what you think you can and cannot do based upon what the authorizing statute in 271 allows. But jurisdictions are getting more creative on how they use 271 SADs. And again, I think that's really a function of the limitations, right, that local governments have to deal with in terms of the availability of tax revenue and fees for services that jurisdictions have the access to on an annual basis. As I've already mentioned, funds that are generated via the assessment under 271 can be bonded against, and that's advantageous because if you structure it correctly with your legal counsel and bond counsel, your financial advisors, you can actually take advantage as the SAD of favorable public issue debt, as opposed to essentially having to deal with much higher rates on that debt as a private sector entity. And certainly in the current environment where interest rates are going up, if you can utilize that as a way to reduce total program or project costs, getting more favorable rate debt, that's going to be advantageous for the project's feasibility moving forward. You can use SAD funds annually as determined by whoever the quote unquote assessment district coordinator determines, or you can spend it all up front, right? I'm going to build a road today, and I anticipate that that road in this defined geographic area that is going to be the SAD is going to cost me $20 million up front to build. So I'm going to issue a note for the $20 million I need. I'm going to spend it all at once, build the road, and then collect assessments over, say, the course of 20 years to retire and repay that debt. That's completely acceptable. Or, as we have seen other SADs do, and some SADs that are currently in the process of being created, the idea is to collect assessments on an annual basis and then use those annual revenues to do the things that we want to do. In the past, things have changed a little bit, but the city of Reno had two special assessment districts in the downtown core. There was a police SAD and a maintenance SAD. The police SAD had historically been used to pay for additional police officers who would be stationed specifically in the downtown Reno core as part of the city's larger revitalization and redevelopment efforts. The maintenance SAD was used to collect annual assessments to power wash the sidewalks and to hang and water the flower baskets up and down the Truckee River corridor. That's changed a little bit as the new business improvement district-ish has been established, but that's how the city of Reno used those two SADs for many, many years. The redevelopment agency of the city of Reno was tasked by the city council to determine on an annual basis what was needed to fund additional police services and additional maintenance services in the downtown core. That assessment was then calculated and then assessed upon participating property owners within the SAD, collected on an annual basis, and then expended on an annual basis. So there's plenty of examples out there of both approaches, doing the bond for it all up front, spend it all up front, and then use the SAD to retire the debt, or collect assessments on an annual basis to fund the things that the SAD has been determined and created to do. With that, again, there's good flexibility in 271 on how you can utilize it for general improvements, again, acquisition, demolition, using it to support rehabilitation efforts, property improvement programs, marketing, maintenance, law enforcement, now fire services, as that was added to 271 a session or two ago, business improvement districts in the whole 9 yards. Again, a lot of potential uses, and of course, run it through your legal counsel before you actually start the creation process and the utilization process. So with that general overview of SADs in 271, kind of transition a little bit to some of the other tools. And again, tax increment areas as outlined in NRS Chapter 278C, and as many of you know, there's some legislation or some bill drafts, at least one being considered, that would amend part of 278C for the coming legislative session for 2023 to focus on like transportation and housing development. TIAs in general have been the dark horse. Under 278C, not really used, at least in my personal opinion, to their full and maximum potential. If you ever have the chance to go check out Nevada State College and the city of Henderson and what the city of Henderson, Nevada State College, and the Nevada System of Higher Education have done, go check it out because it blows me away every time I see it. Most of the development of Nevada State College's new campus in Henderson, outside the downtown area, has almost all been funded using 278C and capturing incremental property tax revenues generated as a result of the new development that has occurred in the surrounding area around Nevada State College's main campus in Henderson. It is absolutely mind-blowing how successful an approach that has been. And I don't know why it hasn't been used more often and more frequently based upon that level of success. I think probably it might be just a degree of unfamiliarity and uncertainty in using this tool. But it's a tool that I wanted to share with all of you and bring to your attention because, again, I think that as local government budgets, cities and counties in particular, continue to be squeezed, just as a natural result of how we've structured our fiscal system, I think it makes sense to look at all the tools and start evaluating the potential of all of them to do the things that we need to do, and that our citizens, our property owners, our residents, our visitors, our business owners expect us to do as the public sector. Very quickly, and again, this is where you get legal counsel and the attorneys involved in the process. But there's generally 5 steps, give or take, in the establishment process, and they look pretty similar to what you do with the SADs. Again, without the caveat of the financing component being reversed like they are in 271. But in 278C for a tax increment area, the first step is, again, the local governing body, and the local governing body must start the process by statute. This can't be done by a private sector interest or anybody else. City or county has to officially start the process. By resolution, you just, again, direct your city county engineer or designates to start the process of studying an area for potential inclusion into a new tax increment area. You want to begin the process of developing a preliminary plan and a preliminary estimate of the undertaking. How much revenue do we need? What we're going to spend it on? Again, kind of that fiscal feasibility and even the economic impact side. A statement of the proposed TIA or tax increment area that should include the last finalized amount of the assessed valuation of taxable property within that proposed TIA. Now, this is an important thing. The tax increment area is not a tax. It is a reallocation of existing property tax revenue that is going to be generated in that geographic area identified as a TIA. But even though it's not, and I can't emphasize this too much, even though it is not a new tax, because if the TIA is established, it will begin to reallocate the way in which property tax revenue would be normally distributed in that geographic area to the tax increment area. You do have to start with an assessment of what the current total assessed value of all property and by property within the proposed TIA is. And then from there, you can begin to kind of estimate what new development, new property development is going to do to total assessed value and ultimately the amount of property tax revenue generated within that district over the years that the TIA will be established for. Once you get that done, you also, within kind of this initial feasibility assessment, is to develop, define, and create a statement of how much estimated potential property tax proceeds are going to be generated really on an annual basis over the life of the tax increment area. Once you get that done, then you go again through the multiple steps of establishing this. You do need a resolution again to start the studying process. You are going to have to identify in that resolution, as a result of the preliminary analysis, what portion of the expense of the undertaking the TIA will be paid with proceeds of various securities. So you can use TIAs to issue debt, and you want to have a rough estimate. I mean, rough by public government standards is actually a pretty detailed statement, but a general statement of how much of financing will be, resolved or covered by issuing of debt, how much of the remaining portion of the expense of TIA activities will be financed via incremental property tax revenues collected or other sources of revenue, and then the basic security and any additional security for the payment of that debt, securities, bonds, notes, whatever, that the TIA, the tax increment area, is going to issue. Again, these are questions for bond counsel, your finance staff, and your attorneys. There's some flexibility there, but again, there are definitive boundaries of what you can do in terms of structuring the financing process. And even though I'd like to consider myself fairly knowledgeable about these issues, I would always point you in the direction of your bond counsel, your finance staff, and your legal counsel to start answering these specific questions. Then the next step is really ensuring that the resolution moving forward in terms of the preliminary study and the eventual establishment of the tax increment area must designate the actual location of the tax increment area. And typically, at least in the case of Nevada State College, again, not a lot of practical experience with this stuff because it hasn't been used, generally contains a list of actual parcels by APN, the assessor parcel number of all property that's going to be within the tax increment area, as well as a general description, right? You know, what are the general boundaries and borders of the tax increment area? And then that usually accompanies, or what accompanies that is an actual list of all the APNs that are in that initial establishment of the geographic district that is the TIA. Parcels obviously change. You know, you may have a large parcel of, say, 10 acres, right, in a new designated tax increment area. And over time of the TIA's existence, that parcel is going to be subdivided and sold off, right? You know, housing development might come in, and out of one large parcel, 30 parcels might be created. If that's the case, there's just a normal process working with your county assessor to make sure that the boundary and parcel list of the TIA is also updated on an annual basis. And you also want to probably include major public right-of-ways, publicly owned assets, you know, streets, roads, gutters, curbs, alleyways, you know, that aren't parcelized. Usually that's included as well. The city county engineer or designates must file with the county city clerk or designates all the preliminary plans, all the cost estimates, and statements of expenditures, securities, all that. And then once all that's been done, and upon reviewing the preliminary plan and going through the process of amending it, revising it, improving it, whatever, and all the accompanying documents, typically then the local governing body, and that can be done in like a couple of weeks, a couple of months, a year, whenever, the local governing body, the city council, county commission, will provisionally order the creation of the tax increment area via resolution and then via ordinance down the road, or whatever process you employ that is consistent with the state open meeting law and other applicable state statutes regarding, you know, development of budgets, and all those elements as well. Like I said, this is a high level overview of the process. There are many other T's to cross and I's to dot, which are just too much to talk about in even a 2 hour, hour and a half session that we have today. Whoop, went too far. What did I do? There we go. NRS Chapter 244A027 through 056 lists and defines all the eligible infrastructure projects that county governments can pursue. And again, these are elaborated upon and thoroughly defined within 244 separate statute, what is permissible and not permissible that cities, or in this case, counties can pursue. Flood control projects, overpass, sewage, street, underpass, water projects. Again, you can check the definitions for yourself in the statute. And of course, for city governments, municipalities with city councils, similar, almost identical definitions exist, but in a different chapter, NRS Chapter 268, Section 682 through 728, on what a flood control project is, overpass, sewage, street, underpass, water. Again, the language is almost identical. There are notable differences, and again, talk to legal counsel, but typically, these are the projects that you can utilize NRS 278C, the tax increment area for. There are some exceptions. There are specific exceptions for Nevada, for the Nevada system of higher education, which enabled Nevada State College to use tax increment area generated revenues to finance the construction of new buildings that form the backbone of the campus of Nevada State College. Obviously, what Nevada State College and the city of Henderson has done don't really fit into the definitions of any of this. We're either counties on the previous slide or cities on this side. So there are some additional parts of 278C that outline specific eligible projects for specific entities. But again, just for cities and counties, that's pretty comprehensive, right? Flood control, overpass, sewage, street, underpass, water projects. Again, the main takeaway here is that there's a high degree of flexibility and possibility of using this. And like 271, the special assessment districts, the legislature has already authorized you to use this as a city and county. And as we know, as Dillon's law states, cities and counties, for the most part, can only do what the legislature empowers them to do. It is what it is, although there are exceptions there. But again, the great thing is with 278C, the legislature has already authorized cities and counties to use this for these types of projects. So there's at least the potential to study and consider its utilization. And maybe you get into the planning process and it just doesn't make sense, right? So stop looking at it and start looking at something else. Again, flexibility and tools in the toolbox is what we're interested in identifying. This is as rudimentary a graph as one can possibly get to understand how tax increment financing works. And tax increment financing, or TIF, is the principal way in which tax increment areas are financed, as well as redevelopment districts. We'll get to that in a minute. The line that is dotted and red is going back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the process of establishing a 278C tax increment area. You have to determine what the base assessed value and base property tax revenue collected is in essentially year one of the tax increment area. Every dollar that is generated from that base assessed value and those base associated property tax revenues are allocated normally as though the tax increment area did not exist. So in Nevada, just randomly taking a city or a county, if I have a piece of property that pays property taxes, those property taxes are divvied up amongst various eligible jurisdictions. You know, the city gets a point or a part if there's a city, the county gets some, the school district gets some, the state of Nevada, you know, state government gets some, and whoever else is entitled to getting a chunk of that property tax bill. Just look at your property tax bill, you know, to see how much property tax you're paying to different taxing entities. It's not just the city or the county you live in. Everything above that base, however, with some exceptions, and again, talk to your attorney because it's very geographic based upon what those exceptions are. Everything in area one under the black dashed curve that is growing over time is allocated and collected by the tax increment area. And then the tax increment area uses those incremental property tax revenues to finance all the things that we want to do within that tax increment area. And that continues over time for as long as the tax increment area exists. But again, everything under that dashed red line is the base and is normally allocated as if the tax increment area didn't exist. And this has always been kind of the justification, if you will, for tax increment financing, is that if not for the improvements that in this case a tax increment area is making in that geographic area that is the tax increment area district, the incremental growth, the black line in incremental property tax revenues, would not be occurring, right? It is the reinvestment of collected and focused incremental property tax revenues that helps fuel additional incremental revenues over time. Now that's the theoretical argument. And as someone who started his work in redevelopment, I'm a redevelopment booster, and I'm a booster of tax increment financing. But I also wrote a dissertation that was highly critical of how redevelopment works and how tax increment financing works, because I can tell you over the course of 70 years of tax increment financing be redevelopment. That isn't always the case. There are many exceptions. And sometimes there has been a tendency to cherry pick areas that are going to have naturally occurring appreciation given development that's already planned for them, or maybe just, hey, it's an attractive piece of land and we know there's going to be development, so let's overlay some type of tax increment financing district so we can grab all that increment and screw over the other taxing districts. There is a lot of that, not just here in Nevada, but across the entire United States. But again, the general argument is the only way you get those incremental property tax revenues is for the investment in upfront incremental revenues that the TIA, the tax increment area, is going to make. So that's why theoretically the tax increment area is entitled to grabbing those incremental property tax revenues. But again, also in this case, everyone that's entitled to property tax revenue from the base gets their property tax revenue like no tax increment area exists. It's just the stuff between the black curve and the dotted red line that goes to the tax increment area. Like pretty much all these other financing tools, you can use tax increment area revenues to bond against. You can use it for, again, the various infrastructure that are permitted under 278C and the subsequent other entities. They're probably not as flexible and as varied as what is permissible under 271. There are limitations on what you can do with 278C tax increment areas. But again, it's a fairly comprehensive list, at least in terms of public infrastructure. And the exception for the Nevada system of higher education is that you can use tax increment areas to actually do new construction. And in the case of Nevada State College, building a new 4-year university, essentially, overnight. And again, if you haven't checked it out, go check it out. It is incredibly impressive. And that's coming from a University of Nevada, Reno faculty member. I have lots of love and appreciation and respect for what the folks at my sister institution at Nevada State College with the city of Henderson have done. It's been brilliant, and I give them all the accolades in the world. With about an hour left, I want to kind of go through the remaining stuff relatively quickly. And I will make sure that all of you get the slides for this presentation. And then again, the recorded presentation will be posted on the chapter's YouTube channel, hopefully relatively soon. But the next two redevelopment districts under NRS Chapter 279, there's a long history of use with them. There's not much surprise there, and general improvement districts under 318, they're going out of fashion. It's just becoming not very feasible or practical to use them, so they're kind of dying a quiet death. But there's still tools in the toolbox, so we might as well look at them. But obviously too, some of this may require expanded discussion. Hopefully all of you have my contact information. If not, I'll put it in the chat box after the formal presentation when we get into Q&A. You can always reach out to me, and I'm always happy to set up one-on-one meetings just to have an expanded conversation. Well, let's talk about redevelopment quickly. As I said, everything related to redevelopment you can find in NRS Chapter 279. The general argument is that by targeting redevelopment and revitalization efforts within a defined geographic area, you create benefits that expand beyond just the existence of that geographically defined redevelopment district, creating new employment opportunities and new business development, mitigating existing blighting conditions like poverty or obsolescence and vacancy of existing buildings and property, really to create county-wide and region-wide benefits. Now that's the theory. There are, translation into practice is something else. One thing that you have to realize with those benefits is that redevelopment is really the only tool in this toolbox where we are leaving the public sector behind, and we are really putting more of our efforts into private sector activities. And as you move away from the public sector and become or begin acting more like a private sector entity, like a developer or an economic development organization, you are increasingly exposed to larger macroeconomic conditions. And a lot of the redevelopment agencies, pretty much all of them operating throughout the state up to 2008 and 9, because this is a property tax-based approach, it uses tax increment financing like the tax increment areas, all of them got impacted fairly significantly as a result of the collapse of the US financial system and the national real estate market in 2008 through 2010 as part of the Great Recession. And very few redevelopment agencies have really recovered from it. The property tax base was just wiped out because of the massive and sudden declines in property values as real estate markets essentially came to a grinding halt. So those benefits, even though they are private sector in nature in terms of job creation and income growth and alleviating blight, can dry up very quickly because you are more exposed in redevelopment to the ups and downs of a capitalistic market system. And that's not a critique. I'm a true blue, capitalistic go market kind of guy. But you have to be realistic and understand that over the course of 30, 40, 50 years, that redevelopment agency is probably going to have to weather 3 to 5, maybe either 6 or 7 recessions. And that's going to negatively impact the ability of the agency to make forward progress. It's just the reality of it. You're trying to smooth the business cycle, but the business cycle is still a reality and you have to contend with that. Again, process is all laid out in 279, and there aren't many jurisdictions left in Nevada that qualify to have a redevelopment district that could create a redevelopment district. But pretty much everything in terms of the process of formation, ultimate governance and structure of the resulting redevelopment agency that is created as part of the process to do the work of the redevelopment district, the duration of existence, and areas that are eligible for inclusion are all outlined in NRS Chapter 279. It is important to note that redevelopment agencies do have a clock running on them. In Nevada, redevelopment agencies start with 30 years from creation to when they may expire. 279 does allow cities or counties, and cities and counties are the only ones that can create them, to essentially get 2 additional 10-year extensions. So you can go from 30 years of existence up to 40 years. And then at the 40-year mark, you got to determine whether or not you're going to go another 10 all the way to 50. But at 50 years plus 1 day per NRS 279, redevelopment districts must sunset, expire, and essentially go back to normal pre-redevelopment existence. And then there is a 100-year kind of cooling off period. That you cannot create a new redevelopment agency around or over parcels that were in the previous redevelopment district. And that's the legislature saying, don't be greedy, right? If you're a city or a county, you don't get unlimited time and access to unlimited incremental property tax revenue. You have to return that increased property tax base, hopefully at the end of 30 or potentially 40 or 50 years, back to all the taxing entities that are eligible for those funds. Similar types of restrictions exist for GIDs, tax increment areas, SADs, but are a lot less, firm. They're a little more spongible. But even then, that's getting into a legal question, and I want to avoid that. I've laid out the process here. And again, this process looks like the process for everything else. City council, county commission starts the process, go study it. Typically, you go get a consultant or you designate staff to do what is called a physical property survey, where here you are trying to count up all the blighting conditions as defined in NRS Chapter 279 that exist within the designated study area for a redevelopment district. And then you're trying to make the argument, right? So that the city council or the county commission can make the finding that there is sufficient blight as defined in NRS Chapter 279 to create the district and use redevelopment moving forward. Typically, this process does require development and submission of a preliminary plan both to your planning commission as well as the city council, county commission, who's ever doing the authorization. Then you go through the process of drafting a draft redevelopment plan. Then you go through the process of submission to planning commission, city council, county commission. And then once you have made multiple, improvements and refinements to the preliminary plan, then the draft redevelopment plan. And that's also going to include the financial feasibility assessment and the development of what are called owner participation rules or the owner participation agreement. That's usually a much shorter document, but it outlines specifically how property owners within the redevelopment district, if established, can directly interact with the redevelopment agency to pursue projects. So the redevelopment agency just doesn't get to pick and choose how it's going to do business. You actually have to construct your rules. It's almost like the constitution for the redevelopment district, the owner participation agreement or the owner participation rules. Once all that has been developed and you've gone through multiple iterations and revisions, then you go through a series of public hearings. Typically 2 with 30 days apart at a minimum. Most jurisdictions go with 90 days to enhance the public participation process, where the city council or county commission reads an ordinance to adopt, and there's an elaborate presentation of the plan findings, the owner participation agreement and rules, and then they vote and establish the district by ordinance. But they have to do it twice. Again, minimum 30 days apart. More standard is 90 because you really want to enhance the public participation process. And then you sit on your hands for 90 days at a minimum, where there is a challenge period. Other states have really significantly opened up what any citizen, resident, visitor, property owner, anywheres can challenge the establishment of the district. In California, when redevelopment was a thing before the statutes were suspended by Governor Schwarzenegger to begin with and Governor Brown to officially essentially kill redevelopment in California, challenges could be brought about because you didn't like the color of the cover page of the redevelopment plan. In states like Nevada and other states with restrictions on what can be challenged and not challenged, it's much more restrictive and really has to be a procedural matter. You didn't take it to the planning commission. You just did something in violation of state law in the prescribed process. You can't really challenge in Nevada on like findings or, conclusions and analysis used in the plan, the redevelopment plan itself. But hey, once you pass the challenge period, it's all go. You start building the capacity of the redevelopment agency, you start collecting incremental property tax revenues, and you go to work, doing all the things that redevelopment allows you to do. Again, before you start doing all of that, there are some preliminary things you need to do once the district is established, because redevelopment agencies are somewhat independent entities from the city government or the county government that creates them. And the purpose of creating a degree of independence and separation between the redevelopment agency and the city or county is to really mitigate liability, because the redevelopment agency is going to start engaging in real estate development activities. And there are going to be failures, and you want to minimize exposure to the city or county that creates it by creating this semi-autonomous independent redevelopment agency that'll do all this stuff. So you have to go through the process of creating a physical structure for the agency. And you don't really worry about that with like GIDs, SADs, tax increment areas, because you can use your existing city or county government or designate like a HOA to worry about that. Here, you have to actually kind of stand up almost an independent pseudo public private entity. So what's the physical structure? Where is it going to be housed? Who is the staff going to be? Is there going to be an executive director, economic development managers, real estate managers, whatever? Typically, then you actually begin the process of developing strategic plans for the district itself and for the redevelopment agency. This is always a problem, or at least I've encountered this as a problem when creating new redevelopment districts. Everybody, property owners, residents, visitors, businesses, everybody wants to know, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to use the incremental property tax increment revenues that you're going to collect, what are you going to do? Are you going to build a road? Are you going to do small business development? Are you going to do commercial facade programs? What are you going to do? The city and the county legally cannot answer that question because it would be answering for a pseudo separate entity that doesn't exist yet. The redevelopment plan and the owner participation rules you create by the city and county actually get transferred over to the redevelopment agency and it becomes their documents. So if you're developing strategic plans as the city government or the county government, that's going to be problematic because those are not your plans. Those are the plans of the redevelopment agency. And that's the same thing with like issuing debt, collecting revenue, incurring expenses, hiring staff. That's the decision of the redevelopment agency, not the city government or the county government that creates it, with asterisks. Because again, the city and the county that brought the agency into existence can take it out. Again, with some requirements that you properly sunset so you can collect revenues to pay debt and all that good stuff. But ultimately, power does rest with the city government and the county government to terminate the redevelopment agency during the process. But all the things that the redevelopment agency are going to do are going to be the work of the redevelopment agency. And there have been notable examples here in Nevada, California, and other states across the United States where the city or county government that created the redevelopment district and agency did not do a good job creating a firewall between the city and the county and the redevelopment agency. And then that redevelopment agency got in trouble. Really no fault of its own, just bad timing in the market. The economy turned and property tax values collapsed, but we're still hanging on to $10 million in tax increment financed redevelopment bonds. But the agency is dead, right? It's insolvent. It's not collecting enough revenue to pay the debt and pay staff and all the things it needs to do. Well, who's responsible for that? Well, if you've created a good firewall between the city and the county government and the agency, the people that bought the debt are on the hook. That's the price of buying securities in a market. And you can insulate and protect the impact or mitigate the impacts to the city or the county. But if you're intermingling staff and activities and you're not creating and adhering to the firewall, the city or the county government that created the district in the first place would be on the hook for obligations that the agency is no longer able to meet. And I've seen it in California, I've seen it in Nevada, I've seen it in dozens of other states. You just got to make sure that you create the firewall in the first place and you abide by the firewall over the course of the agency's existence. Because the agency is going to engage in risky real estate development projects. And there's no guarantee. In fact, in redevelopment, in the redevelopment agency I worked for here in Nevada, and then a redevelopment agency I worked for in California, our success rate was about 10%. 1 out of every 10 projects, be it residential development, a new condominium, be it, a new commercial shopping center, be it a new industrial park, whatever it was, we were lucky if 1 out of every 10 projects we started actually got to completion and open and started generating property tax revenue. That's just the nature of real estate development. And it's even harder in the built urban environment where you start to really encounter a lot of things that can blow up a project and no fault of your own. You just want to make sure, right? Keep the firewall in place so you let the agency take the hit, not the city or the county. Again, I've kind of touched upon this a little bit. There are a lot of things that you can do with redevelopment to support various spin-off development outside of redevelopment district. So your district may be here, but as you improve everything within the geographic area of the redevelopment district, all of a sudden development starts occurring outside that district because, hey, it's a hot area and developers want to get in on this. So you can start to see that spin-off development. If you do redevelopment right, you really are just trying to be a catalyst to support new private sector investment in an area where there hasn't been a lot of investment over a long period of time. You don't want development just in the redevelopment district. As the city or the county, as the community, you want it everywhere where it's appropriate to have that development. Again, redevelopment has been used as a long-term financing strategy. Again, it can go out 50 years from its creation to address a variety of economic, social, concerns and issues that have plagued a specific geographic area for a very long time. And a lot of those are specifically illustrated and outlined in NRS Chapter 279, the redevelopment statutes, of what constitutes blight, both from a physical property standpoint, obsolescence, deterioration, poor infrastructure, teeny tiny parcels that you can assemble and fracture in ownership, to the non-property based stuff, right? Lower than low median income levels, high levels of poverty, high crime rates. All of that is captured by the definition of blight under NRS Chapter 279. And hopefully, the redevelopment agency is really going to be focused on financing what we call new and transformative projects. I've always said that if redevelopment is done correctly, and if it does its job the way it should be doing its job, we get to a point where the private sector says, thank you so very much. You have got the ball rolling. Now, please get out of our way and we'll take it from here. That's the purpose of redevelopment, is to take a geographic area where there is no momentum, right? It is an economic and investment wasteland for the most part. It is blighted per the state definition. And then mitigating those blighting issues through new and transformative projects to get the ball rolling again, to demonstrate to the private sector that money can be made here, that this is a good place to invest. Now, that certainly opens up questions for another day: gentrification, dispersing indigenous local populations that already live within the redevelopment district. And I've seen a lot of that too, where redevelopment agencies have just gone full-on gentrification at the expense of people already living in the area of the redevelopment district. But I've seen also a lot of redevelopment agencies do it what I would think is the right way, is to try to figure out how do you actually meaningfully improve the lives of people living within that redevelopment agency and district, and then adding all the other stuff. And you do that through transformative projects, because there's no way the agency can do it all, right? There is no way for any single redevelopment agency to do all the development to completely transform an area. The goal is over 30 years and potentially even 40 and 50, just to get the ball rolling, so that the private sector looks at it and goes, that's a good place to invest. Great, good job. Now get out of the way and we'll take it from here. That is the underlying theory of redevelopment. Again, like SADs, tax increment areas, even GIDs, you can use it as matching funds. I've seen redevelopment agencies do this, go after EPA, Environmental Protection Agency grants, U.S. Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation grants and funding sources that usually requires match. Redevelopment can be used. In fact, redevelopment was initially created back in the 40s as the source of match, as the federal government got into the federal urban renewal world. Again, you can overlay redevelopment with things like special assessment districts, so you can create additional leverage. And again, the big financing tool here is tax increment financing. But whereas tax increment financing is somewhat limited and restricted under the tax increment area statute, in redevelopment, it's much broader. You get to grab significantly more incremental property tax revenue to move forward and fund your activities and efforts. There's no way I can cover all the things that you can use redevelopment dollars for. Again, pretty much everything we've already talked about, plus the GIDs, plus everything else. There are obviously restrictions and limitations, more on the procedure of how you use funds that a redevelopment agency can generate, but property and even non-property based approaches to economic development. And again, redevelopment, as opposed to everything else, really is an economic development tool. Everything else serves a public interest, and economic development serves a public interest, but this specifically is all about economic development. How do I incentivize and encourage new investment by the private sector in the geographic area? That's what this is all about. The other stuff covers things like public infrastructure and public facilities and assets, with some of the economic development stuff. But as we know, the line between what is community development and what is economic development is probably a lot more blurry than probably initially thought of. This is almost identical to the chart, the very uber simplistic chart I showed you for tax increment areas. Again, just like tax increment areas, in the year the agency, the redevelopment agency district is established, you identify a base assessed value and a base level of property tax revenue. And for as many years as the district exists, up to 50 years max, those property tax revenues from the base are distributed normally to the city, the county, the school district, the state, and any other eligible property tax collecting jurisdictions. It is only, again, stuff in the incremental window between the black dotted line and the red dotted line that goes to the redevelopment agency. They get first take. There are other restrictions, but they're fairly technical, and no redevelopment agency in Nevada has ever been successful enough to reach the caps that actually do exist on the amount of incremental property tax revenue that a redevelopment agency can get. The point is that if you are super successful in your use of a redevelopment district and you generate even more property tax increment than you could ever hope for, stuff above, kind of in this nebulous white space above the dotted black line, then goes back to all the eligible taxing entities like the city, the county, the school district. And of course, at year 30 or subsequently year 40 or 50, you terminate the redevelopment district and everything goes back to normal. I've touched upon this. Again, these are the general benefits of using things like tax increment financing and redevelopment. Again, you're just trying to create investment where disinvestment has reigned supreme. And the redevelopment agencies that have been successful throughout the United States since the 40s have been able to accomplish all these things, right? You know, increase the diversity of taxpayers, all that good stuff. You know, one thing that you probably also need to think about as you establish your redevelopment district is how big the redevelopment district is going to be in terms of size. You do want to kind of check these boxes, which are also kind of end goals of the district as well. But typically you don't want all the taxpayers within the defined geographic area that's going to be the redevelopment district to all be residential, or to all be commercial, or to be all industrial. Because changes in the economy are going to affect the values of different properties over time. So you kind of want a mix, right? A good diversity, so you're not throwing your lot into just one basket. That goes for property types. You also even want a diversity as best as possible in terms of economic conditions. There's got to be a spark, right? Some little flame that you can build some momentum on. Potential for development over the future. You know, are there potentials for additional revenues in other cases like purchasing and selling land? How quickly are you going to be able to bond as the redevelopment agency? And what are the various economies of scale, right? What are the leverage opportunities moving forward? Typically, these are things, again, you want to consider in the formation process. That's redevelopment in a nutshell. We got about 34 minutes left, and I'm really going to go through GIDs quick because I think most people, most jurisdictions have given up on them at this point, unless there's any significant change to 318s and the governing statutes. Again, GIDs, unlike everything else we've kind of talked about, is an actual new tax for the most part. Some exceptions, but generally a general improvement district creates a new property tax within the geographic area that the GID is going to be created for. And because it is an ad valorem tax, it is subject to the ad valorem property tax cap that exists in state law, which means once your jurisdiction hits the, I think it's what, $3 and, you know, 3.14, something like that. Once you hit that cap, you can't go above it, right? There are some exceptions, but there really are no exceptions. Once a piece of property is taxed at the cap that exists in state law, that's it. You can't tax anymore. And remember, under that tax cap, everybody's got to fit. The city, the county, the school district, the state, other property taxing entities, everybody's got to fit. including general improvement districts. So there isn't a whole lot of room because most of the jurisdictions in the state of Nevada that would consider the use of a GID are already at the property tax cap. So there's really no room to create a new GID and utilize it. Ultimately, GIDs, and this is right from the authorizing statute, are used to focus on funding programs, projects, and services provided by the public sector that will generally promote health, safety, prosperity, security, and general welfare, right? You know, it's copy and paste out of the state constitution, copy and paste out of the US Constitution. It's pretty limited as opposed to SADs, tax increment areas, and redevelopment districts. It's pretty limited on what you can use GIDs for. The initiation process, again, is going to look like pretty much the process for anything else. You start, simple resolution, designate staff, go ahead and study it, come back with a preliminary plan on what it's going to look like. You can, like SADs, I think I forgot to mention this, GIDs can be, the process of creating it can actually be initiated by owner of property within a potential GID. That's the same thing with an SAD. The initiation doesn't have to come just from the public entity. The public entity needs to create it, but the process of initiating the study can actually come from the private sector. And if a majority of property owners within a defined geographic area want to create either an SAD or a GID, they can petition the local city council or county commission to create, or at least start the process of studying the establishment of the district. Everything else looks like everything else, right? There's an initiating ordinance. There are unique requirements with GIDs, like you actually have to have a statement within the initiating ordinance that specifically lays out what the GID is going to do. You don't need that really for the SAD or the TIA or the redevelopment district, although it's useful and helpful to lay that out in the preliminary plans. Here, you have to have a definitive sentence that says, this is what the GID is going to do and is only going to do over the course of the existence of the SAD moving forward. You also need to consider things like the process of public convenience and necessity for creation of the district. What are the conditions? Why do you need this as opposed to anything else? How the district's creation is economically and fiscally sound and feasible. Are you going to generate enough revenues to do what you need to do? And a service plan, really outlining the processes of doing the things that the GID is going to do. Like all of this, you need a general description of the GID's boundaries and an accompanying list of all the APNs, assessor parcel numbers. And then, of course, the place and time for the hearing that the district is going to be held by the local governing body per the requirements of state open meeting law. NRS Chapter 318 outlines all the very specific powers and authorities and activities that a GID can pursue. Here they are. It's 21 only and not 22. You have to fit your proposed activity within the GID under one of these definitions, either for a city or a county. Definitions may vary, but not much. That said, and even though it is a limiting list, it's a fairly broad list, right? Furnishing electric light and power, furnishing streets and alleys, sanitary facilities for sewage, lighting streets, recreational facilities, space heating, emergency medical services, even eradication of noxious weeds. It's a pretty good set of powers and activities and things that GIDs can be utilized. But you have to use these definitions to fit activity and creation of the GID under. So a little more flexibility, actually a lot more flexibility with special assessment districts, tax increment areas, and redevelopment districts. Again, some of the other powers and activities, this really relates to the idea that you are levying a property tax. That, for the most part, some exceptions, but for the most part, you are levying a new ad valorem property tax with the use of a general improvement district. And that is why you are subject to the restrictions of the ad valorem property tax cap that is set within the state constitution and other state law. There are other revenue sources, but they are honestly going to be minor relative to the levying of a new property tax. The GID, depending upon how it's created and the powers granted to it, can acquire and sell property. It can charge tolls. It can charge for services, depending upon how you create the GID moving forward. And you can use all of that revenue, again, like anybody else, to issue debt, get money up front to do the things that you need to do. Or again, you can collect revenue on an annual basis and pay for expenditures as they're occurred year by year over the course of the existence of the GID. So there are other revenue sources, but they're, at least in practice, the experience has been across the state fairly minor and insignificant relative to the levying of the property tax that, again, has to be subject and fall under the property tax cap that exists in state law. So that's the presentation and overview in a nutshell. I know I have hit on a lot in a very short period of time, even though I've gone, believe it or not, for 90 minutes now. It's probably a lot to digest. Again, I'll get this material out to all of you, but I'm going to stop the share screen now. And if there are any questions or just general discussion, I'm more than happy to field questions or listen to what you have to say at this point. So thank you very much. I'll open it up. Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, ideas?
First of all, I want to say thank you, Fred, for putting this on. There was a lot of really good information, but I do have a lot of questions for you. So my first question, in the redevelopment plan, when a plan has been adopted and at the time it was adopted, you know, there might have been some content in the plan that doesn't necessarily reflect today's date of 2022. The procedure to modify your redevelopment plan within your agency.
So it's pretty straightforward. You know, typically redevelopment agencies will have what we call redevelopment agency boards. And that can be an independent appointed group. That could be your city council or your county commission, whoever is designated the redevelopment agency board. And that's going to exist somewhere in the plan. Typically, amendment of the redevelopment plan and subsequent strategic and action plans are done first with the redevelopment agency board. They will work with staff to make changes, because you're right, Kathy, changes are going to happen. The world of 2022 now into 2023, believe it or not, is probably radically different than what the world looked like 10, 20, 30 years ago when the district or a district was created. So things are going to change. The blighting conditions are going to change. The strategies are going to change. The opportunities are going to change. And hopefully they've changed. Static, bad for redevelopment. You want change. But the process really just begins with the designated redevelopment agency board working with staff to identify elements of the redevelopment plan that need to be changed, or subsequent related strategies, or even the owner participation agreement and rules. Ultimately, you probably need to go back to the public entity that established you in the first place. So if it's City of Elko Redevelopment Agency, there's going to be a redevelopment agency board. They can go through the process, right, of working with staff to make changes, modifications, amendments, improvements, whatever needs to be done. But at some point, they're probably going to need to go back to the city council of the city of Elko that created the redevelopment agency in the first place to approve those changes. I think in the city of Elko's case, the agency board and the city council are probably one and the same. But even when they meet, I bet you there's a point where the city council adjourns and the redevelopment agency board convenes, even though it's the same people in the same room on the same day.
We keep them separate for all purposes.
There you go. So ultimately, it's up to the redevelopment agency board and staff to make the changes as necessary. You probably do have to go back to the authorizing jurisdiction just to get their blessing. But usually that's staff and the agency board telling the council, hey, you know, these are the changes we need. Go ahead and accept it. And then ultimately the agency board will approve those changes, whatever those changes are. Because remember, the agency, the redevelopment plan and all subsequent strategies belongs to the redevelopment agency. They don't belong to the city or county government that created the agency once the agency is created. All that has to be done by the redevelopment agency.
Okay, so my second question is the example that you gave for the city of Reno for maintenance for their maintenance special assessment district. When they selected the district boundaries of that for, you know, the planting, watering and such, did they just pick the properties adjacent to that area, or did they go out and beyond that area?
So back to the conversation on special assessment districts under 271 again, City of Reno that's changed when the business improvement district was created, had these two pseudo special assessment districts, a maintenance SAD and a police SAD. And the boundaries were different, even though there were areas where they overlapped. The police SAD was pretty much, with some exceptions, the parcels that were included in redevelopment project area number 1, right? You know, there would be police services, additional police services provided to properties within the existing redevelopment district as part of the city's efforts to address economic and social and cultural blighting conditions. The maintenance SAD was really tied to key corridors, up and down Virginia Street, Center Street, Sierra Street, and what would become the Truckee River Walk, where the city, the redevelopment agency, you know, were investing in new infrastructure like initially pavers for the larger, wider sidewalks, then the stamped concrete, and then some of the street beautification stuff. Most of that, only the properties that abutted those major transportation corridors, Virginia Street, Center Street, Sierra Street, and the Truckee River corridor were included in the maintenance district, with some exceptions, kind of, you know, jutted out in other corridors, you know, including some alleyways, major alleyways to do some improvements and ongoing maintenance. That's a process that usually involves some conversation, you know, with property owners that could be impacted by being in an SAD, and having the conversation with them and saying, hey, you know, if you're good with being in this maintenance SAD, there's an opportunity for you to get some additional infrastructure around your property and have that infrastructure maintained by that maintenance SAD. The maintenance SAD was kind of drawn oddly because some property owners opted out and said, no, we don't think the value is there in terms of the additional assessment that you're going to charge on us, so we want out. You can't cherry pick per se, but that's part of the process. So the police SAD was a much broader geographic area that really didn't focus on commercial corridors, whereas the maintenance SAD was really drawn to focus on major commercial corridors, just getting the property that was immediately abutting and adjacent to those major commercial corridors, Virginia Street, Center Street, Sierra Street, and the Truckee River corridor within the downtown area.
And if the property owner opts out, then he's not being assessed a special assessment?
Short answer, yes. But there are other things behind that, yes. Again, you have to avoid, per state law, cherry picking districts. You just can't, you know, do squiggly lines to exclude some and to benefit others. There has to be essentially a good faith effort to include, you know, comprehensive property within the SAD related to the purpose of the SAD and who is going to be benefiting from that SAD. But typically, yes, if a property owner is not included in the SAD, they will not pay the additional assessment, because the argument is,
right, you
are geographically locating benefit to those that are paying for that benefit, excluding those that are not paying for it.
And then who collects the assessment? Does it come through your tax bill?
It can. Typically, oh God, I hate that word because there's no typical in this regard. In some cases, a completely assessment is mailed to the affected property owner or business owner or individual included in the SAD. And
And
that's
if they don't pay, you have to lien them?
typically how it's worked.
Right.
Hopefully you don't get to that point, but hey, you are getting a benefit and you were told up front, being in this district means that you're going to pay for that benefit. And liens have been used. In other cases, you can just go through collections because again, it's not a tax, right?
Right.
It looks like a tax, it quacks like a tax, but it's not a tax. So you don't necessarily collect the assessment the exact same way you would a property tax or a sales tax.
Okay.
But
And
I
then
have
what
seen
about-
jurisdictions do it that way.
What about, like, if you determine that the entire project is gonna be, let's say, $1 million, and that the city is going to put in 500,000 towards that project, can they use redevelopment funds to put in towards that project of that special assessment district, and then assess the other 500,000 on the district?
Just on face, the details you provided, I don't see why you couldn't do it that way. Again, there are existing SADs and redevelopment districts in Nevada today on December 6, 2022, where SADs and redevelopment districts are layered on top of each other. And depending upon what they're trying to do, some of the dollars for a project or an initiative comes from the redevelopment agency, some comes from the SAD, some may come from the city government or the county government or a private sector source. Again, it's all about leveraging, and however you can construct the leverage to fund what you need to fund, pursue it. Always involve legal counsel, right?
Yes.
Don't do anything to get yourself in legal hot water. Don't do anything until legal counsel has signed off on it. But from what you've just shared with me in that hypothetical, I don't see a reason why you couldn't do it.
Okay, so one more question, and this should be my final question. Can, let's say Elko County, can they create a tax increment assessment on the property owners in Spring Creek to build a connector road that ties the city of Elko to, that would be more in the city of Elko, but it would be a connector to Spring Creek, like Ericart connection?
So upfront, typically for any of these tools, SADs, tax increment areas, redevelopment, or general improvement districts, the entire district has to be located within the physical territory and jurisdiction of the entity that creates it. For those of all of you not familiar, Spring Creek is a community in Elko County, just outside the city of Elko. It's an unincorporated Elko County. So if the city of Elko was to create like a tax increment area to build a road to connect the city of Elko with Spring Creek to facilitate transportation, the initial pass would be, well, the entire tax increment area has to be in the city of Elko to meet the state statute requirement. That said, there have been conversations in other parts of the state where multiple jurisdictions, in this case, maybe the city of Elko and Elko County, would jointly create a tax increment area. And that tax increment area would extend beyond the county and city line of city of Elko, Elko County, to include maybe parts of Spring Creek. Again, I am way deep in the theoretical waters here, and at a certain point, you're going to have to involve legal counsel. I know I keep saying that, just don't want to get anybody or myself in trouble. But I don't know of any part of state law that would prohibit that. And in fact, there have been cases where these tools, specifically the SAD and the redevelopment district in particular, revenues generated from within those districts for those agencies, an SAD or a redevelopment district, have been used outside the district, with the finding that it was necessary to expend those dollars generated from the taxing district or special assessment district and a redevelopment district to benefit the mission of the agency or the district. So Reno Redevelopment Agency is a good example of this in the past, where in the past, the Reno Redevelopment Agency used incremental property tax revenues collected by the redevelopment agency to build affordable housing outside the redevelopment district. It was outside the district. It was relatively close to the district, but the argument was we need additional affordable and workforce housing to support some of the economic development efforts in the downtown, like expansion of the casinos and a new ballpark and new public sector jobs. We can't find a good piece of land that is cheap enough that the private sector wants to sell for us within the redevelopment district to pull this off. So the finding is made, well, let's go spend some of the redevelopment dollars outside the redevelopment district, ultimately to support what we're trying to do within the district. And I don't know of an example, honestly, of an SAD or tax increment area or a GID pulling that off. But I don't know anything within the statute that wouldn't prohibit you from at least exploring this potential of establishing a tax increment area or an SAD that crosses a jurisdiction line, or that is with one in jurisdiction, but could benefit property outside the district. Again, there's a whole series of analyses you got to do, a whole series of findings you got to make, and you don't want to do anything until you get legal counsel involved with you. And again, I'm not an attorney, I don't know the law better than an attorney, but I think it's worth a conversation. Because at the very end of the day, the worst the attorney can tell you is no, you can't do that. And if that's the answer, then that's the answer, and you move on, you try to do something else. But why not explore it? Be creative, because that's where we are in local government, trying to be creative in funding these resources and assets and facilities we need.
Well, the problem is that our redevelopment agency only gets, $350,000 a year, and every project is over $1 million. And so it takes us 5 years to make enough money to get a project off the ground. And then in the meantime, you have everybody saying, well, I want new sidewalks and I want landscaping, and so the problem is just the lack of funding.
Too many mouths to feed and not enough food to go around. Well, welcome to life in the public sector in Nevada in particular. And it's a good point, because again, none of this are silver bullets, right? None of these 4 financing techniques are going to be silver bullets. But again, the leveraging part of this is critical. And part of this is to hopefully get jurisdictions thinking creatively about how they can start addressing these issues. And it may take a combination of, and it may require utilizing other tools in the toolbox. The critical important takeaway is that there are tools in the toolbox, and why the city of Elko and Elko County couldn't work on developing a special assessment district to build a road and maintain a road. I don't see an initial reason as to why you couldn't do that. Other questions have to be asked and answered, but I think there's a certain possibility, to explore it. And again, given the limitations of where we are in terms of public budgets these days, continuing to rely on the traditional sources is not going to work unless the legislature completely overhauls Nevada's public finance system. We're going to have to be more creative, and jurisdictions have gotten creative, and it's why we're having this conversation today. No solutions, just more questions and opportunities. So we have about 9 more minutes. Any other questions, comments from anybody else before I call it a day? 3, 2, you might be muted.
Hey, Fred, this is Scott Carey. Since we have additional time, I'm just kind of curious if have much background about why the state of California took redevelopment away, and if something like that may happen here in Nevada.
So Scott's asking a loaded question, because I think Scott knows that I was both a beneficiary and a victim of that. So during the global financial crisis and the Great Recession between 2008 and 2010, public budgets were getting crushed. And that was true in California. And in California, there, like other parts of the country, a long old fight between counties, cities, and school districts. And school districts typically, and this is a gross generalization, but it is what it is, have argued for years, especially in California, that redevelopment takes money out of the mouths of children and puts it in the hands of private developers. And the school districts won the argument in 2008 through 2010 with the legislature and essentially said, the school districts are dying. There is not enough property tax revenue to go around. And given the funding equations in California at the state level for education, the legislature was about to be on the hook for hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of educational funding that wasn't available from local sources. So a decision was made. Terminate redevelopment statewide for the most part and transfer incremental property tax funds to the school districts via the state to backfill holes in school funding. I was working for a redevelopment agency, the city of Carson, Southern California at the time. So I'm a little biased. I think state of California threw the baby out with the bathwater and made other problems bigger down the road. At the time, redevelopment was the #2 provider of affordable housing in the state of California, second only to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. By eliminating redevelopment and the required state mandated 20% affordable housing development set aside that every redevelopment agency in California had to do. So 20% of all incremental property tax revenues redevelopment agencies in California collected had to go directly back into the development of affordable housing. Look where California is now, right? 10 years after the fact, and no way to finance affordable housing development. And they are at critical crisis level, if not beyond. And now there's talk. There's been talk by the current governor, as well as many of the jurisdictions, to resurrect redevelopment and reinstitute that 20% set aside to start addressing the housing crisis. That said, I understand completely the position of the school districts. And as an educator at a 4-year public university, you're not going to see me criticize public education. I'm a booster of it. I'm an employer or employee of it. So I'm a little biased there. But I think in California, there was a deal cut between the school districts and the legislature that effectively ended redevelopment. And there were real abuses. And I will say that the school district and the legislature had legitimate criticisms against the way in which some redevelopment agencies were conducting their business. My dissertation that I wrote at USC documented that and said, this is unacceptable. But my argument was better to reform and deal with those abuses on a case-by-case basis instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But there was an opportunity for the school districts and the legislature to use those abuses and the financial crisis between 2008 and 10 to do away with redevelopment. And like I said, I think that created longer-term problems because you took away the one tool cities and counties had to directly finance affordable housing development, as well as all the other economic development stuff, small business development, business creation and attraction, needed infrastructure improvements. It's not like cities and counties had a lot of extra money laying around in their general funds to pick up the slack when they lost redevelopment. So all that was lost. And again, we see the results. And that's what you get, I think, from a public policy standpoint of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Hopefully, California, the legislature, the governor, the cities, the counties, and the school districts can figure out some compromise, right? Because some of those issues that redevelopment agencies were handling have now hit epic crisis levels in California. And I worry that could happen in other states, maybe Nevada. I don't know. We'll see. If I had a crystal ball, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. But I think that's a real issue moving forward.